The city streets buzzed with the usual morning rush, cars honking, people hurrying to work, and the occasional street performer trying to earn a few dollars. It was just another ordinary day, or at least that's what everyone thought. 17-year-old Jamal sat near the window on a crowded bus, his earbuds in, nodding along to his favorite playlist. He had just finished basketball practice and was heading home, his gym bag resting on his lap. He wasn't the type to look for attention. He mostly kept to himself, focusing on school, his part-time job, and making sure his little sister had everything she needed. Life wasn't easy, but he was doing his best. As the bus pulled up to another stop, an older woman stepped in, her hand gently resting on her belly. She looked tired, her face worn with exhaustion, her posture unsteady as she scanned the packed bus for a seat. People barely glanced up, too caught up in their own worlds. Jamal didn't hesitate. He pulled out his earbuds, stood up, and gestured toward his seat. "Here, ma'am. You can sit here." The woman's face softened with surprise. "Oh, thank you, young man," she said, easing herself into the seat. She smiled at him, a genuine, warm smile that Jamal wasn't used to receiving from strangers. He simply nodded, brushing it off. It wasn't a big deal. His mom had raised him to respect others, and he knew it was the right thing to do. The bus rumbled along, and he moved toward the back, gripping the overhead railing as he balanced himself. Minutes passed, and just as his stop neared, the woman turned to him, her eyes filled with something unspoken. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. "Take this," she said, pressing it into his hand. Jamal blinked, confused. Thanks." He wasn't sure what to say. "Read it when you get off," she whispered. Then, as if nothing had happened, she turned back, staring out the window. The bus screeched to a stop. Jamal stepped off, the cool air hitting his face as he shoved the note into his pocket. He didn't think much of it at first. Probably just a thank you. But something about the way she looked at him, the way her hands trembled slightly, made his stomach tighten with curiosity. Little did he know, that simple act of kindness had just set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. At the same time, across town, Officer Reynolds adjusted his belt as he leaned against his patrol car, eyes scanning the street. His fingers drummed against his holster as he exhaled sharply. He had been on the force for years, and if there was one thing he prided himself on, it was keeping control. His version of justice wasn't always by the book, but in his mind, it got the job done. When he spotted a young black man walking down the sidewalk, he narrowed his eyes. Something about him, maybe the confidence in his stride or the way he wasn't afraid to meet the world head-on, rubbed Reynolds the wrong way. He didn't know who this man was. He didn't know his story. And he had no idea that the person he was about to frame was no ordinary citizen. He was a highly trained Navy SEAL, a man who had seen the worst the world had to offer and had come out stronger. But by the time Reynolds realized his mistake, it would already be too late. Jamal walked home with his mind still half on the note in his pocket. The paper felt light between his fingers, but something about it felt heavy. He could still see the woman's face, the way she looked at him before handing it over. It wasn't just a thank you. He knew that much. When he got inside, he tossed his bag onto the couch and pulled the note out. The handwriting was neat, but slightly shaky. "You don't know me, but you just changed my life. I was losing faith in people, but you reminded me that kindness still exists. If you ever need anything, call this number. No matter what." Jamal read it twice. It wasn't what he expected. He figured it would be a simple, thanks for the seat kind of message, not something that felt so personal. His eyes went to the phone number at the bottom. Who was this woman? Why did she sound like she had been on the verge of giving up? Before he could think too much, his little sister, Aaliyah, came bounding into the room. She was only 10, full of energy, and always had a million things to say the moment she saw him. "Jamal, you're late. I thought you were going to bring me a snack." He laughed, shoving the note in his pocket. "My bad, Lily. I'll grab you something later." She crossed her arms. "That's what you said last time." Jamal playfully poked her forehead. Yeah, I got you." Their mom was still at work, pulling a double shift at the hospital. It was just the two of them for now, which was normal. Jamal had been stepping up ever since their dad left a few years ago. That's just how it was. As the evening went on, he kept thinking about the note. Should he call the number? What if it was just some random message with no real meaning? But something deep inside told him it wasn't. Across town, Officer Reynolds sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers on the wheel. He had been a cop long enough to know when someone looked off, and the guy he saw earlier?
He had a feeling about him.
Reynolds had built his career on instinct. At least, that's what he told himself. His gut feelings usually led him exactly where he wanted to go. Sometimes, that meant bending the rules. He picked up his radio. Dispatch. Anything on a tall black male, mid-20s, athletic build, walking near Maple and 5th around 4 p.m.? There was a pause. Then a response. Negative, nothing reported. You got a suspect. Reynolds exhaled, through his nose. Just keeping an eye out. Something seemed off. He didn't say it out loud, but it didn't sit right with him, someone like that walking around like he owned the place. He'd seen it before. Young guys who thought they were untouchable. But no one was untouchable. He pulled out his phone and started looking through recent reports, searching for anything he could use to justify stopping that guy if he saw him again. The next morning, Jamal woke up early. His plan was to go for a run before school, but that note still sat on his desk, tempting him. Before he could change his mind, he grabbed his phone and dialed the number. It rang twice before a voice answered. Hello. Jamal hesitated.
Yeah.
This is Jamal. You gave me a note on the bus yesterday? There was silence. Then, a deep breath on the other end. I wasn't sure if you'd call, the woman said. Her voice was soft but firm, like she had been through a lot but wasn't broken. I meant what I wrote. You really did change my life. Jamal sat down on the edge of his bed. I don't really get it. I just gave up my seat. It wasn't about the seat, she said. It was about you. The way you didn't hesitate. The way you showed kindness when no one else did. Jamal didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't used to people reading so much into his actions. The woman sighed. Look, I don't want to get into details over the phone, but let's just say I've been struggling. And yesterday I was at my breaking point. You reminded me that there's still good in the world. I owe you more than you know. Jamal frowned. The way she said it, it wasn't just about having a bad day. This was something deeper. Before he could ask more, she continued, I don't know what your life is like, but if you ever need help, real help, don't hesitate to call me. I mean that. Jamal nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Thanks. I appreciate it. They hung up, and he sat there for a long moment. Who was she? Why did she sound like someone who had been through hell and back? He didn't have answers. But something told him that this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. Meanwhile, Officer Reynolds was back on duty, parked on a quiet street near the same area he had seen Jamal the day before. He wasn't looking for a reason, he already made up his mind. When he spotted Jamal jogging down the sidewalk, he smirked. There he was. Reynolds put his hand on the radio, then hesitated. No backup. No need. He could handle this himself. He stepped out of his car and walked right into Jamal's path. Morning, he said, blocking the sidewalk. Jamal slowed, pulling out his earbuds. Morning. You live around here? Jamal frowned. Yeah. Why? Reynolds tilted his head. Just making conversation.
Jamal didn't buy it.
Something about this guy's tone made his stomach twist. He had seen cops like this before. Reynolds let the silence stretch. Then, as if deciding something, he nodded toward Jamal's gym bag. Mind if I take a look in there? Jamal stiffened. Why? Just routine, Reynolds said smoothly. Unless you got something to hide. Jamal clenched his jaw. He knew his rights, but he also knew how these situations could go. He wasn't about to make a scene, but he also wasn't about to let himself get played. I'm just out for a run, man, Jamal said carefully. Haven't done anything wrong. Reynolds held his gaze, a slow smirk creeping onto his face. We'll see about that. And just like that, Jamal knew this wasn't going to be a normal morning. Jamal took a slow breath, his heartbeat steady but alert. He had been in situations like this before, not exactly like this, but close enough to know when something wasn't right. The officer wasn't asking him anything because he had a reason. He was fishing, looking for something that wasn't there. Reynolds kept his smirk, waiting. He liked the way the kid hesitated. It meant he had him right where he wanted him. He could feel the control settling in, the unspoken power he held in moments like these. Jamal swallowed his frustration and reached for his gym bag, unzipping it just enough to show his sneakers, a water bottle, and a spare hoodie.
See?
Just my stuff. Reynolds glanced inside, but that wasn't the point. The point was making Jamal feel like he had to prove himself, that he had to justify being there. Reynolds had done this before. Sometimes it led to something, sometimes it didn't. Either way, he got what he wanted: control. Jamal zipped up the bag and slung it over his shoulder. Am I free to go? His voice was calm, but there was something firm beneath it. Reynolds studied him. Something about the way the kid carried himself, it didn't fit. Most young men in his position would get defensive, nervous, maybe even aggressive. But this one? He was steady. Too steady. You from around here? Reynolds asked again, his tone a little different this time. Jamal stared at him, debating if he should answer. Then he exhaled.
Yeah.
My house is 5 blocks from here. Reynolds let the moment hang between them, as if trying to decide whether to push further. Then, finally, he stepped back. All right then, he said, almost casually. Have a good run. Jamal didn't say anything. He just nodded and jogged past, not looking back. He didn't need to. He could feel the officer's eyes on him the whole way. By the time he got home, his hands were clenched into fists. He had been careful, done everything right, and still, it hadn't mattered. The whole situation played in his mind over and over again. He could have pushed back, asked why he was stopped in the first place, but he knew how that could go. One wrong move, one wrong word, and suddenly, he wouldn't be just a guy out for a run. He'd be something else in the officer's eyes. He dropped his bag by the door and sat down at the kitchen table, rubbing his face. His sister was still asleep, and his mom wouldn't be home until later. It was quiet, but his mind was loud. His phone buzzed. He pulled it out and saw a message from the number on the note. Did something happen? Jamal frowned, rereading the text. How would she even know? He hesitated before typing back. Why do you ask? A few moments later, the reply came. Call me. Jamal sighed, then pressed the call button. The woman picked up on the first ring. I had a feeling, she said before he could even speak. Something didn't sit right after our talk. What happened? Jamal leaned back in his chair. I got stopped while I was running. A cop. He didn't accuse me of anything, just made sure I knew he could. There was silence on the other end. Then the woman let out a slow breath. I know that game, she said. They make you feel like you have to explain yourself, like you don't belong, even when you've done nothing wrong. Jamal shut his eyes for a second.
Yeah.
There was another pause before she spoke again. Listen, Jamal, I don't want to overstep, but I have a feeling this won't be the last time you see that officer. I don't know why, but something tells me he's not done with you. Jamal opened his eyes, staring at the ceiling. Yeah, he admitted quietly. I got that feeling too. Meanwhile, Reynolds sat in his car, tapping his fingers against the wheel. Something about that kid nagged at him. He wasn't just some random guy on the street. There was something more. The way he carried himself, the way he didn't flinch. Reynolds had dealt with enough people in his career to recognize when someone had training. But training in what? He started running searches, checking through records, but nothing stood out. No criminal history, no trouble at school.
Clean.
Too clean. Then he dug a little deeper. And that's when he found it. Jamal wasn't just some kid from the neighborhood. He had a family member in the military, a father who had served before disappearing from the picture. That alone wasn't enough to mean anything, but then Reynolds found something else. A classified file, partially redacted, but just enough was visible to confirm his suspicion. Jamal wasn't just some athlete. He had been trained by someone. The way he moved, the way he kept his cool. It all made sense now. Reynolds leaned back in his seat, a slow smirk forming. Well, he muttered to himself. This just got interesting. Jamal had no idea what was coming. Jamal felt the weight of the morning still pressing against his chest as he sat on his bed, staring at his phone. The conversation with the woman still lingered in his mind. The way she had known something was off before he even said anything, it was like she had lived through this before. And maybe she had. He wanted to push it aside, pretend it was just another day, but deep down he knew better. That officer, Reynolds, wasn't just going to let this go. He saw it in his eyes. That wasn't just some random stop. It was a warning. A test. And Jamal had a feeling he had only passed the first round. Later that evening, after making sure Aaliyah had eaten and finished her homework, Jamal stepped outside for some air. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the quiet neighborhood. It should have felt peaceful, but something about the silence made him uneasy. Then he saw the car, parked across the street, just far enough to seem casual, but close enough that Jamal knew better. A police cruiser. His stomach tightened. Reynolds. Jamal forced himself to act natural, walking down the steps like he hadn't noticed. He pulled out his phone and acted like he was scrolling, but his mind was racing. What was Reynolds doing? Waiting for something? Watching? He considered going back inside, but he didn't want Aaliyah to see anything. She was too young to understand, and the last thing he wanted was to scare her. Instead, he walked to the corner store, keeping his movements steady, purposeful. If Reynolds wanted to intimidate him, he wasn't going to let him see that it was working. As he walked, he dialed the number again. The woman answered on the first ring. "He's outside, isn't he?" Jamal exhaled through his nose.
Yeah.
There was a long pause. Then, she spoke in a tone that was different this time, firmer, edged with something deeper. "Listen to me carefully.
You need to be smart about this.
You can't let him bait you." Jamal clenched his jaw. "I know. But what does he even want?" Another pause. Then she said, "Control." Jamal stopped walking. The words settled in his chest, heavy and undeniable. She continued, her voice low. "Men like him? They don't like what they can't control. You stood your ground. That's enough for him to make you a target. But that's not the worst part." Jamal's grip on his phone tightened. "What do you mean?" She hesitated before finally saying, "I did some digging. That officer? Reynolds? He has a history. Complaints filed, investigations opened, but nothing ever sticks. He knows how to play the system." Jamal let out a slow breath, his stomach nodding. "He's looking for a reason," she continued. "And if he can't find one, he'll make one." Jamal felt his pulse in his ears. He thought about going home, locking the door, pretending none of this was happening. But deep down, he knew that wasn't an option. Running wouldn't change anything. He forced himself to keep walking, stepping into the store like everything was fine. He grabbed a bottle of water and a bag of chips, paying quickly before heading back out. The cruiser was still there, headlights glowing dimly in the fading light. Jamal didn't stop. He didn't look. He just kept walking. But as he reached his house, he heard the engine start. A slow, deliberate roll forward. Jamal stepped onto the sidewalk, gripping the strap of his gym bag as the car eased closer. Then, the window rolled down. "Reynolds." "Evening," the officer said, his voice casual, but his eyes sharp. "Nice night for a walk." Jamal met his gaze but said nothing. Reynolds smirked. "Saw you earlier. Thought I'd check in. Everything all right?" Jamal forced himself to stay calm.
Yeah.
"Just getting some air." Reynolds nodded slowly, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. Then, after a pause, he leaned slightly out of the window. "You know, I looked into you," he said, almost conversationally. "Didn't find much. No trouble. No history. Pretty clean." Jamal didn't react, but his muscles tensed. Reynolds tilted his head. "But there was something interesting. That father of yours? Military man, wasn't he?" Jamal's chest tightened. Reynolds smiled. "See, that caught my attention. Because you carry yourself a certain way.
Calm.
Controlled. Like someone trained you." Jamal didn't answer. He just kept his expression steady. Reynolds let the silence drag before chuckling. "No need to look so tense. I'm just making conversation." Then, without warning, he threw something onto the ground between them. A small plastic bag. Jamal barely had time to process before Reynolds leaned out, his voice smooth. Looks like you dropped something. Jamal's stomach dropped. Reynolds tilted his head, watching him carefully, waiting for a reaction. Jamal knew exactly what this was. A setup. If he reached for it, if he even moved the wrong way, this could turn into something else, something he wouldn't be able to talk his way out of. His breath came slow and even, his heart hammering against his ribs. Reynolds' smirk widened just slightly. Jamal knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Jamal's eyes stayed locked on the small plastic bag at his feet. His pulse pounded in his ears, but he forced himself to stay still. Every instinct told him this was the moment Reynolds had been waiting for, the excuse, the reason, the so-called evidence. If he so much as twitched the wrong way, it wouldn't matter what the truth was. The story would already be written. Reynolds leaned out of the cruiser just a little more, still smirking. "Go on," he said, his voice light, teasing. "Pick it up." Jamal didn't move. He kept his hands visible, refusing to take the bait. He could feel his entire body coiled like a spring, his mind racing through every possible move, every possible way out. Then, from down the block, the sound of a door opening. Footsteps. "Jamal?" He turned slightly, just enough to see his neighbor, Mr. Carter, stepping out onto his porch. The older man's sharp gaze flickered between him and Reynolds, instantly sensing something was wrong. Reynolds noticed, too. His smirk faltered for the briefest second. Jamal saw an opening. He took a step back, raising his hands slightly, not in surrender, but in clarity. "That's not mine," he said, his voice calm but firm, loud enough for Carter to hear. Reynolds' eyes flickered, calculating. Jamal felt a shift in the air. He had thrown off the officer's rhythm. Another voice joined in. "Everything all right here?" This time it was a woman, Ms. Rodriguez, from 2 houses down. She stood on her front step, arms crossed, watching carefully. Another porch light flicked on. Someone else stepped outside. Reynolds tensed. This wasn't what he wanted. He hadn't expected witnesses. Jamal could see the irritation in his eyes, the way his fingers tapped once, just once, against the door of the cruiser. Then, just like that, the smirk returned, but it was thinner now. Forced. He exhaled like this was all just some misunderstanding. "Relax, kid. Just a little mistake. Must not be yours after all." Jamal said nothing. He didn't need to. The moment was shifting out of Reynolds' control, and they both knew it. The officer reached down, picked up the bag, and pocketed it like it was nothing. Then he gave a small, almost lazy nod. "Have a good night." And just like that, he drove off. Jamal didn't move until the car disappeared down the street. He let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders, trying to shake the tension from his body. "You all right, son?" Mr. Carter asked, stepping off his porch. Jamal nodded. "Yeah," he said, but he wasn't sure if he believed it. Ms. Rodriguez lingered for a moment before nodding toward the street. "That cop's been circling this neighborhood for weeks," she muttered. "Be careful." Jamal swallowed hard, nodding again. As the neighbors drifted back inside, he stood there for a moment, staring at the empty road. His mind was still racing. This wasn't over. Reynolds had made that clear. But something else was nagging at him. The way the cop had changed tactics so fast, the way he had seemed so certain that Jamal would take the bait. Like he knew something Jamal didn't. His phone buzzed. He pulled it out, expecting another message from the woman. But it wasn't. Unknown number. "He's not working alone." Jamal's stomach tightened. He stared at the message, rereading the words, his breath catching in his chest. Before he could respond, another message popped up. "You need to move. Now." Jamal's heart pounded. Then, just as he looked up, headlights flickered at the far end of the street. Another cruiser. And it wasn't Reynolds this time. Something was very, very wrong. Jamal's grip tightened around his phone as he watched the second cruiser ease toward him. His chest felt like it was caving in, but he forced himself to stand his ground. He didn't know who had sent the message, but one thing was clear. This wasn't random. The car stopped just past his house, the engine idling. Then, the door opened. A second officer stepped out, one Jamal had never seen before. He was taller than Reynolds, broader, with a face that looked like it had seen years of this job. But his eyes, There was something different about them. He wasn't smirking. He wasn't playing a game. "Jamal Carter?" the officer asked, his voice steady. Jamal didn't answer right away. He glanced at his phone, rereading the message. "You need to move."
Now.
His gut told him to listen. "I need to grab something inside," Jamal said, keeping his tone even. The officer shook his head.
"No, son. You need to come with me."
Jamal's breath caught. "Why?" His voice was calm, but his mind was racing. The officer glanced down the street, then back at Jamal. "Because Reynolds isn't done yet." Jamal's stomach twisted. The front door creaked open behind him. Aaliyah stood there, rubbing her eyes, confusion on her face. "Jamal?" His heart clenched. He turned slightly, keeping his voice light. "It's okay, Lee. Go back inside." But she didn't move. The officer stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Listen, kid. I know who you are. I know who your father was." Jamal froze. The officer exhaled. "Reynolds thinks he's got this all figured out. He's been digging, trying to twist things, but he doesn't know what I know." Jamal stared at him, his mind racing. He had spent years avoiding any connection to his father's past. It had always been easier that way. But now, it seemed like the past had found him anyway. The officer reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Jamal. "Read it when you're somewhere safe. But right now, you need to trust me." Jamal hesitated. Then, from the distance, another set of headlights appeared, Reynolds. Jamal didn't wait. He turned to Aaliyah, forcing a smile. "Go inside. Lock the door." Her little face scrunched in worry, but she nodded and disappeared back inside. Jamal took one last look at his house, then followed the officer to the car. As they pulled away, Reynolds' cruiser slowed, his smirk returning as he watched them go. But this time, Jamal wasn't afraid. Because whatever was in that note, whatever his father had left behind, was about to change everything. Jamal sat in the passenger seat, his fingers gripping the small folded note like it held all the answers. The city lights blurred past the window, his mind racing with everything that had happened in the last few hours. He wanted to demand answers, to know why this officer, who seemed to know so much, was helping him. But he also knew that asking the wrong questions too soon could mean getting the wrong answers. So he stayed quiet, waiting. The officer drove in silence, only speaking once they were far enough from Jamal's house. "I know this doesn't make sense right now," he said, eyes still on the road. "But I need you to trust that I'm trying to fix something that should have been fixed a long time ago." Jamal looked down at the paper in his hand, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. Finally, he unfolded it. It was a short note, the handwriting rough but familiar. "Jamal, if you're reading this, it means something's caught up to you. I hoped it wouldn't. But if it has, you need to know the truth. Trust the right people. And don't let fear decide your next move. Dad." Jamal swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the note. His father had always been a mystery, a man with more secrets than stories. He had spent years trying to distance himself from that legacy. And yet, here he was, right in the middle of something he never saw coming. He turned to the officer. "How do you know my father?" The man exhaled. "We served together. A long time ago. He saved my life." Jamal blinked, caught off guard. His father never talked about his time in the Navy. It had always been a shadow, something left unspoken. He knew this day might come, the officer continued. That someone like Reynolds would try to use your name, your history, against you. That's why he left me instructions. He looked over, his expression serious. "To make sure you had a way out." Jamal sat back, his mind spinning. They pulled into an empty parking lot, and the officer cut the engine. "You're not safe in that neighborhood right now," he said. "Reynolds has been building a case, fabricated or not. He wanted to make you a target." Jamal clenched his jaw. "Why me?" "Because you didn't bow," the officer said simply. "And men like him? They hate that." Jamal exhaled, running a hand over his face. "So what now?" The officer pulled out his phone and made a call. He spoke in hushed tones, using words Jamal didn't fully understand. After a moment, he hung up and turned back to him. "There's a federal investigation into Reynolds," he said. But they've never been able to pin anything on him. Tonight, that was him getting desperate. He knows his time's running out. Jamal frowned. So what do I do? The officer studied him for a long moment before answering. You stay quiet. You let us handle Reynolds. And when the time comes, you tell the truth. Jamal hesitated. He had spent years avoiding conflict, keeping his head down, making sure Aaliyah had a stable life.
But now?
Now he realized that staying silent wouldn't make the problem disappear. He nodded slowly. Okay. The officer started the car again, driving toward the outskirts of town. I'm taking you somewhere safe for the night, he said. Tomorrow, everything changes. Jamal stared out the window, watching the darkened streets pass by. He thought about his father, about the words in the letter, about the fact that no matter how much he had tried to stay out of the fight, he had been born into it. The next morning, Jamal sat in a room filled with people he didn't know, answering questions from federal agents who had been waiting for the right moment to bring Reynolds down. He told them everything about the traffic stop, about the bag Reynolds tried to plant, about the message warning him to leave. By the time he left the building, the weight in his chest felt different. Lighter. Not because the fight was over, but because he had finally stopped running from it. A week later, Reynolds was arrested. The case against him stretched further than Jamal had imagined. Evidence tampering, false arrests, intimidation. It wasn't just Jamal. There had been others. Too many. The news spread fast. The neighborhood that had once watched Reynolds patrol their streets with unchecked power now stood taller, knowing he wasn't coming back. Jamal returned home, stepping onto his porch, feeling a strange sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. Aaliyah ran out, wrapping her arms around him. Are you okay? She asked, her voice small. Jamal knelt down, looking her in the eyes. Yeah, he said softly. We're okay now. That night, as he sat by the window, staring at the quiet street, he pulled out the note one last time. His father's words echoed in his mind. Don't let fear decide your next move. For the first time, Jamal truly understood what it meant.